And maybe someone in my group may have something a little different, but how tough it is just to move into that unknown. It's pretty tough if somebody tells you to just, and even in verse 4, it talked about how Abram was 75 years old at the time that he left. For 75 years, just to leave everything that you've known, leave your family, and to take God at his word, to be able to just walk into this unknown. And the point that I have jotted down is the faith that it took to believe God at his word and to begin to take that step.
Now, let me pause you now. I get the gift. The goal, though, was heart, and then intro, body, conclusion.
Okay. And so point was faith, and then close was so Abraham went. Verse number 9, that he went. And so he began to take that step.
All right. Thank you. Next group.
I see I didn't write down heart of the text, my group.
Okay.
But these are the things that I wrote down. I told them to jump in if I forget something. We took it and we split the scriptures up into 3 sections. For the opening, what it says, and close, it says, for Genesis, we said that verses 1 to 3 was the call to Abram. And then we said from verses 4 to 9, it was the obedience in what he does. And the close would be the whole thing would be that it was obedience and his response to obedience if he did what he was told to do.
Got it. Thank you.
For Psalms 23, we said verses.
Showing out that this is the star group. Go ahead, show off.
No,
Stop it.
Psalms yet. He's still at Genesis.
Right. Let's follow what his lead. We only on Genesis. Only on Genesis.
We're just waiting.
Oh, okay.
On Genesis.
All right, cool.
So my group, we agreed that the heart of the text was just surrounding like trusting in God. For opening, we believe that would be focused on just the Lord giving direction. The body would be surrounding Abraham following that direction, regardless of like what made sense to him or what was being supported by other people. And the closing would be just that God is faithful to sustain us through whatever that journey he calls us on.
Got it. Thank you. I think we have one more group. That was 4 groups of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
We got one more.
Go on, Margot or Noel, one of you, somebody who's succinct. Come on.
Well, we just came up in our group, just the heart, as looking at it as obedience being the heart of that passage or of those scriptures. We looked at the opening or the body of it as speaking more on the benefits of what obedience would do, how God gave him, he just led him into his thoughts before Abram moved. So the opening would be the benefits of his obedience. Okay. And then we expounded, we left the scriptures and thought that the closing would be basically the outcome of Abram's story. Basically what we know to be Abram's story and what ended up happening from his obedience.
Got it.
Okay, I'm jumping in with our group. We had that the heart of Genesis was the call of Abram. Mm-hmm. And then the intro would be that it's also the beginning of a nation. And then the body included in there is that God calls him Abram, and that's his name. But God sees him as Abraham, and he will become Abraham, the man of faith. And our close is that the promises that as he does this, God will make him this mighty nation.
Got it. All right. So,
Amen.
Amen. Now, I do want to give space. So I know that there was one group that did get a chance to get to the other 2 texts. And I would be remiss not to at least allow you the opportunity to speak about the work that you did. Did you want to do the same for Psalm and Revelation, or did you want to just hold?
Waiting on you.
Okay. Well, let's talk through that piece, and then we'll see if we can get back to it. So we have this great idea, right? So we get to the heart of the text, and I think we're all there, right? We're all in this space. We have the call of Abram, what this means, the development of the children of Israel. The heart of this text is God's call to Abram and Abram's response, right? That is the heart. That's what it's about. And nestled in there are these amazing promises and everything. Now, here is the homiletical art and the craft that we need to draw out is, so if this is the heart, the call, and there are facets of that call that we can look into, whether it is the faith, whether it is the promises, whether it is his age, right? These are all the different lenses we can bring to that same heart of this text. The question then is, how do we open it? How do we open it? And so I'm about to go back and reshare, share my screen again. So now, once we have a text, it is good for us to kind of know the type of the text, because the type of the text should lend to the form of the sermon. Text and sermon should complement one another. So if you had to think about it, what type of text is Genesis chapter 12? Do you know?
Is it like a narrative, historical narrative, like a story being told? Okay.
In fact, that's the exact one. It is a historical narrative.
Okay.
Right? And the historical narrative is important, number one, because it's a story. And so this lends to a certain way of grabbing, but also it is historical. So this means that there are elements of the story that are true. We believe them to be exactly as is, where some things in maybe the poetry or even in the wisdom may not be historically true, but there might be melding together of things. The parables, right, are not, let's say, the telling of the parables might be a historical narrative, but the parable itself is not a historical narrative. It's not, oh, this is an exact person. It might be an idea. So knowing that changes the way that we can lead into this story, because it's a story. And one of the gifts about preaching, and I love preaching, especially in stories, is that people typically listen to stories more than they listen to anything else. People have less fight with a story than they do with an argument, than they do with whatever. So this lens for how we may want to start. Now, I'll just list out here. There are other biblical genres that the text will be written in, whether it's the law, right? And we see this like Exodus and Numbers, Deuteronomy. We have poetry. We often just think of Psalms, but that is not the only place. There's poetry written both in Job and in Songs of Solomon, right? We have all of this. We have the wisdom literature highlighted, especially in Proverbs, but it's available other places. Prophecy, apocalyptic literature, the Gospels, and then the epistles. Each one has a different form of writing, which also can lend to a different form in preaching, and may lend to a different way that we want to start the sermon itself. So as a basics, the structure of a sermon is basically similar to a paper, right? You have an intro, a body, and conclusion. Like this is fairly easy. Now, because it is basic doesn't mean that it's easy to do or easy to identify how we should do it, but it often follows the very same pathway, right? We're going to open it up. We're going to dig deep into it and give the heart of everything that is there. And then we're going to wrap it up and we're going to close it down, right? Like that's just what it is. And the gift then is when we start to look into, well, how should we open this up? I think that the intro sometimes is overlooked at what it really can do for the sermon. The intro answers the question in the audience of why should I listen to you? And I think now more than ever, where attention spans are shorter, people are not given as much time. They want to know, why should I give you credibility? And you have to remember now, the pandemic has lifted this up even more. You're not preaching to people that are locked into a room where you are. You are preaching to people that are wherever they are, with every other opportunity available to them that might grab their attention. The game might be on, they might be cooking breakfast. So in the opening of my message, I'm trying to grab people to help them for why they want to listen to this. So as many of you, when we talked about the text, is of course, we base it in the text, right? So we say, well, the intro, we start talking about really was your first point. Most of you, when you talked about the text, it was like, well, God comes to Abram or God gives promises, whatever. That's really a point in the message. The intro should say, or be something like, how can I connect this? How do I bring people along? So you can open up an intro with a question, right? Have you ever felt that you needed to do something, but it just didn't make sense? Have you ever felt that maybe you were too old or time had elapsed? Maybe that God had forgotten you, and yet you enter into a moment where you see an opportunity and it's right in front of your face. Maybe you open with a story that can draw somebody into this whole idea that you're getting ready to communicate, or a joke, right? Or sometimes you can even use the context and the background of the sermon or that text as your opening. Now, there are a variety of other ways that you can open, right? But I think that we have to be intentional to make sure that we think through that opening. Why should somebody want to listen to me? Why is this text important? What can hook them in? In fact, I used to have a teacher, and the way that she would always say, it is hook, then hook, book, and then took, right? So tell them, how do you hook them in? Take them to the book and give them that information, and then what do they take away, right? Like that was just her frame of reference. And so how do you hook somebody into your message? And if you think about some of the most emotive or some of the most memorable sermons that you might have remembered, the intro is the thing that grabbed you. Now, I'm not saying that you should do this, but I never forget, I'm at Salem. It was not too long after House of Hope had opened. T.D. Jakes is preaching. He preaches, reposition yourself. Music has just gone down and everything. And he slowly walks on stage and he taps the mic. Folks start going crazy, right? Number one, this is T.D. Jakes, and folks just get excited because he's there. But his rhythm was crazy. Then he hits the mic again. Every moment. Every second. Right. I mean, it is building like nothing I've seen before. He says all of this, and you can hear him counting, and then all of a sudden, last one, nothing else. We don't want to lose every moment of our lives. It might be time to reposition yourself. When I tell you the room was spellbound, folks are screaming and hollering, he ain't opened the Bible yet, right? Like, I mean, it's Reverend Meeks leans over to me and is like, I bet you they didn't teach you that at seminary, right? All you got to do to open a sermon. Now, what I'm saying is that he used the creativity of where he was going to draw people into the message. And the intro is one of the gifts that we're given to be as creative and as open, of course, staying with the track of the message as possible to draw people in. And of course, it needs to be connected to your sermon. And I often think that it doesn't have to be and often should not be long. A 10-minute intro is too long, especially if you're preaching for about 30 minutes, because that means a third was just the intro. A third of it. We haven't transitioned. We haven't done any background. We haven't dealt with any points. We haven't closed it out, right? So I think right around the 5-minute mark is about where you want to be. But if you're really intentional, 2 or 3 minutes can be amazing for an intro. To tell the story of another person, to lead folks in, and now we want to try to bring them there. Then the next, as we talk about, is from intros, then we have transitions. And transitions, just like transition words, helps you now to feel like the sermon is all one. It helps you to move from place A to place B, as opposed to it feeling like a patchwork of just different ideas. I'm gonna tell you this, and then it's over here, then it's over there. How do I move people from point A to B and make it feel smooth? How does it feel almost like a muse, like a song that flows and shifts? And these transitions, how you use them can help you do that. Now, oftentimes my intro isn't the context. Sometimes I'll use context and the context of whatever I'm preaching as transition pieces to help now bring that in, but gives me the freedom to do a little bit more with maybe the beginning of my sermon. And then now that helps you to make this feel like a beautiful tapestry of thoughts. Now I'm recognizing our time, so I'm gonna move through a little bit more. So after that, now you get to the body. And this is the heart of your sermon. This is where you get to all the stuff that you want to say. This is where in the Genesis text, we want to talk about what it means to be called and where with the timing that he's called, and that doesn't matter. We want to lift up that connected to your calling are the promises of God when we're willing to do it. And sometimes it might not make sense, right? You walking through each of these pieces. Your blessings are connected to your obedience, right? Like all of those things. We want to put that into the body. We want people to be feasting off of what we unearthed out of the text. But again, we need to be unearthing this out of the text. It's sitting right there. The text will give you a plethora of ideas of what to unearth to offer to people. That age doesn't matter. You could be 75. And what does that mean? That you don't have to worry. And of course, put that in context, right? Like how long did people normally live? Is 75 that old in Abram's time? Maybe not so old. What does that look like, right? What does it mean to be called a nation? What does Abram even know about a nation? How do we deal with the challenge that Abram is going to be a nation that Abram actually never sees, right? And what does it mean? What does it mean if the promise is a promise for you, through you, that you may not see, right? So that's when we start digging beauty out of this text that goes along much deeper than just some of the stuff that's right at the top. Like we keep excavating, we go deeper and deeper, and we develop the points. And some people, even when they preach, the body may not be, succinct points. I would offer, if you are new to preaching, stick with the structure of points until you get more comfortable, maybe with being able to flow and do it. But my only challenge is if you decide not to use points, you run the risk of people not having stuff to grab onto. What the points are is not just for you, but for the listener, they are tidbits. There's information that I can pick up and I can take with me, so that when I leave a sermon or when I leave a message, not only do I know what the message was about, which is important that the theme is consistent throughout, but also I walk away with something. Man, not only is this about the call of God or about faith, but I know that faith for me is not connected to age. Or I know that faith for me is connected to the promises of God. Or I know that faith for me is connected to what God may do through me and not just for and to me, right? So like, these are all points, but I could grab those because the points gave me that information. And so if you're new, I would encourage to do points. If you're more well-versed, you're more comfortable, you can maybe not do points, but still give people things to hang their hats on as you go through the message. So when they walk away, they have something. And I often think, of course, customary is about 3 points. Sometimes you really only need one. Some of the best preachers I've heard actually have had 1 point, They just said that one point in multiple ways because we know that people learn by repetition. And we keep wanting to give folks everything when the truth is they need to hear the same thing a whole bunch of times before they really get it. And so it might be advantageous that we're still talking about faith. So really my whole point is you got to have faith. You got to have faith even when it doesn't look like it's going to work. You got to have faith when you don't want to do what God said. The point is you got to have faith. They can then figure out even better places to apply it, but you got to have faith, right? Like that is where everything will fall. And then comes now the next portion, which is within your body, and sometimes even you can put these with the clothes or whatever, now come illustrations. And I think some of the best preachers are those that are able to illustrate the text. And illustrations are the windows to your sermon. They help to create the bridge from where the biblical text is to where people are, that they can look in and sometimes look in and see themselves. Or as Charles Spurgeon said, window to your sermon so that they can let the light in, right? They allow the light to flow around in that you're preaching. And Charles Spurgeon is a famed preacher from the U.S. So these are what the illustrations do, and they can come from anywhere, right? Illustrations, whether you're driving down the street and you see a rainbow, or you see the smoke billowing up from a building that is being burned, yet as the smoke goes higher, that typically means that the fire is bigger, right? So how can I use that? The bigger the billow, the bigger the fire, right? Or you can flip it around. Where there's smoke, there's a fire, right? How can I use this as an illustration to show a point that I want to see, right? Maybe I connect that with the Exodus text where we have the call of Moses and there's a fire, but it doesn't speak of any smoke. In fact, nothing is being consumed. This is anomalistic. That doesn't happen. So we have these illustrations that we can use, and we can even use personal ones. I often like to use personal ones, but of course we have to be cautious with that because sometimes in our personal stories, other people are involved. We have to be cautious of bringing our kids or our spouses' stories into our messages in a way that they may not have given us access to, or maybe they're not okay with, or they're embarrassed by. We also have to be cautious on these personal stories because most of the time we only want to tell the personal stories that make us look good. So every time I tell the personal story that I've been through, I come out like the hero. Man, I was following Jesus. And let me tell you, soon as I did this, then this happened and this happened. And look at the blessing of God. What about when you didn't follow? What about when you wasn't Jesus's little cousin? Right? And what happens? How do we use maybe some of those stories too appropriately? Right? Because there has to be an appropriateness. You might not want to introduce your personal infidelity as you've been living into it and you're not far removed from it. Like I've been redeemed from personal infidelity. I did it yesterday, but I'm free today. Are you free today? Is that the story you want to give? Does your spouse know that you're free today and you wasn't free yesterday? Right? Like there's a lot of levels to that, right? So we want to just be cautious to how we even lend in. And then probably even more typical fashion for Black preaching, the close and or the conclusion. Now, Fred Craddock goes through, and I'll give you some resources at the end of this, that he goes through and he says that there are 13 ways that you can close your message. And I love these because this is not all Black preaching. Fred Craddock is not an African-American preacher. However, I've seen many of these in African-American preaching. Mm-hmm. The sermon ends as it begins. Now, this is a beautiful idea, right? I've seen pastors that preach through a text. Let's say we go to Psalm 23. Right? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. They walk you through that whole text. You get there and surely goodness and mercy. Now, most of us will end right there, right? Surely goodness, they follow us. They will apprehend us. But then there's a way that I open with the reading of my text and then I close with the reading of my text. And now after I've preached it, the text sounds different than it did the first time I read it. So now after we've preached through and I come back. The Lord is my shepherd. All the things that I've taught about what a shepherd is and what that means for my life are echoing in the minds of people as they hear me read these same verses that they heard no more than 20, 30 minutes ago, but have brand new meaning. So you can end the sermon as it begins, or you can double back to the initial story. There are multiple ways. You can end with a simple exhortation. He said all of this, summary and conclusion, you gotta have faith, right? If we go back to the Genesis text, you gotta trust God, or you gotta obey. The promises are available. Repetition and summary. Now, this is oftentimes huge in Black preaching, but I never forget, I was listening to a preacher, and they was telling a story. Actually, it was in Fred Craddock's books. They were telling a story about their father, a Pentecostal preacher, preached a message about Samson. Goes through Samson's life, all the things that he loses, but at the end, talks about how he fell at the hands of Delilah. They cut his hair off, gouged his eyes out, and he sat there in the cell as they mocked him, but his hair grew. Sat there in the cell as they started taking over all of his people, whatever, as his hair grew. Did all of these things as his hair grew, because reminder that as his hair grew means the strength is coming back. But I don't have to say that. All I'm saying is as his hair grew. Then all of a sudden, he rises up one day as his hair grew, right? And you can feel the repetition of that message, so much so that sometimes you don't even have to say it. The congregation will say it back to you. He said, and then as his hair grew. The folks said, and then as his hair grew, right? It's that repetition, and it invites the congregation to come and be a part of your message. And they are part of it now. To close it out, there's choral response. And sometimes I've seen it where we lead up to this moment and maybe we close on Amazing Grace. We talk about the grace of God, and then the message actually closes. If you're a singer, which you singing it, or sometimes, as Pastor Meeks will have, Walter Owens will be right there and you'll lead right into that song, Amazing Grace, right? Especially if you're coming out of 2 Corinthians 12 and Paul, we thrice God I've asked, and he says, my grace is sufficient, and you close that on Amazing Grace, right? Imagine the connection now to the choral response. There's an appropriate prayer, and oftentimes these are not just like, kind of shoot from the hip, but these are prayers that are now intentionally written out, intentional to draw us back to what we've come from the message. There's number 6, which is the invitation to some decision. I think Pastor Meeks is amazing at these, where after he's preached all those things, then now there's something for you to do, right? We've seen this problem, we've seen this issue. So will you sign up, or will you do, right? He often does this, especially with his message on how to pray for an hour, right? He walks you through all these things and then challenges us to go and start praying for an hour. It's a great way now that allows a sermon, although it's concluding, to now move further into somebody else's life. Number 7, you can end with a story, right? An appropriate story that closes and summarizes all of this back together and allows somebody to seize the image of what it is that you were talking about. Number 8, and we don't see this in Black preaching as often, but I think it has amazing import, is you can end with silence. And I think there is a point, like if we were preaching Lamentations and we're weeping over what is happening in our culture, in our country, sometimes we don't have to feel that with words. Sometimes it's okay to feel that with the depth of my mourning silence. We just let it sit. And then we move to the next point. You can end with a question, right? This idea of, okay, what do we do next? Will you be like Abram? Right? Will you allow the Lord to be your shepherd? Will you be like the church in Sardis, right? Like that can be that. Now, this one I really like, and it might be less intuitive, but it's called the fractured syllogism. So syllogism is just a line of logic where you kind of give major, minor, and then kind of the conclusion. And so Fred Craddock puts it like this. This is syllogism. All sinners are punished. Jim is a sinner. Jim is punished. That's syllogism. Now, watch fractured syllogism. All sinners are punished. Punished. Jim is a sinner. Jim is forgiven, right? And you can see how that switch is crazy. Oh my God, that's fractured syllogism. It shouldn't happen that way, but there's something that causes it to. It shouldn't be this way, but it is allowed to be this way because, right? How does that change everything? So you have fractured syllogism. Of course, we have the refrain, which is similar to the song. We can walk through that. It's similar to the repetition, but it might be something that we started from the beginning. Sometimes the refrain could actually be the very title of your message, and you just carry it all the way through. Or you can end it with a broken sentence, right? And so this is the space, let me go back. This is the space where you let the people fill in the blank, right? So I did it earlier. I said, the race is not given to the swift or the strong, and I left it. And then you all filled in that space. Now, granted, we found out that that's not what we wanted to say, but what happens when the sermon is like that? So we've preached through the message, and then we go back to all of the pieces, and everybody knows it. The Lord is my, and you walk off. And the people fill in shepherd. The people might even keep going, I shall not want, right? They'll fill in that space. It is a broken sentence, but it draws other people in to fulfill and complete the sermon. Now, this is one that I'm back and forth on, but I had to at least include it because I thought it was thought-provoking, is you deliver just half of a sermon. I would not recommend this on your first sermon or when you just early in preaching, and then let the people create the second half. Right, yeah, you get yourself killed. But Fred Craddock tells a story of a preaching student that tells a story of his brother. His brother loves trains. He goes through all of this, loves trains, sees trains, does this, loves this, knows this about the trains, does this, and then gets to the end where he says, but he's broken because trains aren't used as much. There's not as many people riding the trains. In fact, many are rusted and they're falling apart. And then he says, in the same way that my brother loves trains, I love the church, and walks out. Now, for most of us, you're like, wait, that's a terrible sermon, right? But there's a gift in, if we've lined it up well enough, that people can come back and see the parallel between the way his brother loves trains and the way he loves the church. And the brokenness and the beauty that the trains had and the beauty that the church has, to the way in which the church may be declining and rusted out. And now how do we fix it? I probably will come back at the end of that to give some clarifying thoughts. But that is one of those structures and closes that he provides. All right, real quick. And I know, Yvette, I said I wasn't going to do an hour and a half, so forgive me. But here are some references that I'll do. And I'll send this presentation over to Reverend Yvette so that you all can have access to it and follow back on it later. But Fred Craddock's Art of on the Craft of Preaching is one of my favorites. Doctrine That Dances by Robert Smith Jr., another great one. Otis Moss III and his father come together with the idea of preach, which really kind of goes through the African-American tradition even more. And so does Robert Smith a little bit. Then E.K. Bailey has one with Warren Worsby. And this is really kind of rewriting of an interview, but I think it's really great to hear two famed preachers talk about preaching. And so, of course, E.K. Bailey is African-American and Warren Worsby is white, but to see how closely they align. Dr. Frank Thomas, if you have not, is great at the art of preaching. And they like to never quit praising God, talking specifically about the African-American tradition of preaching. And then Tony Evans' Book of Illustrations, because there are some times where it might be hard to do. Sometimes it's good to add those in. But also what I use it for is not as much as to take his illustrations, but to see the way he tells the illustration. Mm-hmm. There's something to even the art and the form of his illustration that can become helpful for me. So got about 4 minutes left. I'll stop to share. Any questions or comments? I know that was a lot.
Charlie Dates does number 7 extremely well. Number 7 is finishing with like an exotic or a great story after Absolutely. The message.
Absolutely.
Charlie Dates does that geniusly.
Absolutely. Geniusly. Absolutely. And And I know one of the people that he leaned on heavily was Gardner C. Taylor. If you never looked to like the dean of preaching, I encourage you, although his rhythm and structure is slightly more dated, it is his storytelling ability that will blow your mind completely.
You can find a lot of him on YouTube.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of my favorite preachers.
I thought today's lesson was very informative. I enjoyed it. And what was the name of that last preacher again?
Gardner C. Taylor.
Gardner C. Taylor.
He is known as the Dean of Black Preaching. Martin Luther King and many of the civil rights struggle era individuals actually take their timing from people like him.
Yeah.
His illustration about why people should support children on this side of it, as opposed to those who are anti-abortion, is masterful. You should. He's amazing, just amazing.
Yep.
Any other questions for the master?
Not even. Just a student.
No, we're all students, but no. Any other questions for Pastor Jason? I'm so grateful for him being among us. You're not worthy.
Yeah.
You're not worthy.
This is a very sobering, just the sobering class. As exciting as it was, it's sobering, and it just emphasizes the responsibility that I have to communicate properly. Because when I'm done communicating, people are going to try to live this thing out. And how they do that determines on how I've effectively communicated. So
yeah,
it's sobering.
Absolutely. And this is no easy task. And it should.
I just thank you. You're so smart.
Listen, you got to remember, you was my Sunday school teacher. I got that from you. I'm just repeating what I learned in Sunday school. Absolutely.
Yeah, question for you, Pastor Jason.
Please.
Are there ever times when you, and I know it, I've heard this before, when you have prepared a sermon, and you prayed, you labored over it, and you get before your audience, and then God just says, nope, I want you to go a different direction?
There have been. And oftentimes I wrestle because sometimes I've heard that terminology misused for a lack of preparation, right? Like, when I get up there, the Lord just gives me right what I'm supposed to say. Yeah. That would mean that often that God only works in the spontaneity. Like God is not an author of order and creation, and that's not true either. However, that being said, there are definitely moments where I've gotten up there and the ethos of the room, the preparation of my own heart, I sensed that God said, go a different way. And we follow. But that different way also means it only works well when I've studied enough that it already is in my heart.
Yep.
Right. And so the thing is, we think that that means, it's no preparation. No, me saying that I'm going in a different way meant that that means that day I came with multiple sermons ready. I already knew what the other stuff was. So I was able to make that transition. Now, maybe it wasn't as formed as I would have wanted it to be, but I've done the work. I've done the preparation. I've been praying on it already. So it was able to come up. Nothing can come out of you that isn't in you. Right? And then the other challenge that we run into is when we try to make it seem like it was something that is not, and then we start saying things in error because they sound good, but they're not theologically accurate.
Right. And that's my point for us as new preachers. We're not as versed maybe, and I know one of our speakers, Reverend Breckenridge, is our mentor, had speak about how like he would read a passage like 30 times and make sure that he has that passage in and out. as opposed to, and then you come in and you may read it a couple of times, and then you think you got the sermon ready to go, and then when you get up there, it's like, oh, this doesn't make sense.
Correct.
Maybe God is something to go a different direction. But the danger with that is you don't want to misspeak and say something in error, trying to be obedient, but maybe you don't have the skill set to just change up, and that's why I was bringing up that point.
Yeah, and I think that's good, but I think it's being honest. So if God is telling you to go a different way, and let's be clear, if God is saying it, then God is going to help you through that. But it may not sound as refined as a message that you should have been able to put together. But the heart of it will be good enough that it reaches people. I've preached messages that as a sermon, if I was in a homiletics class, it was an F. It was terrible. But the point of the message was good enough that it grabbed and touched people, right? And I couldn't preach it any other way. And there are times where you just have to be able to do that. Hold on.
And it's pretty scary when that happens to you. I was preaching for a pastor locally at Good Shepherd Church, and I had a message that I was going to preach that Sunday at his invitation. And when I got there, I had prepared, a couple of weeks ahead, and it was really wrestling. And God was like, no, this is not the message. And I don't like doing that either. But I had another message, and I wound up preaching the message that I felt like God was really pressing on my heart. And it was specific because there was a young lady who was there. She's 11 years old, who was about to have surgery the next day. She is a cancer patient, and God had me preach that message specifically for her. And for that congregation that was dealing with some illness at the time. I didn't understand it at the time. I was afraid at the moment, and I thought that I was scared about having to change too. But that, he does what he does well. So it is scary.
It is very scary. However, too, and this is why I would say, and I would recommend to any preacher, if you're not preaching regularly, that does not mean that you're not creating sermons regularly. The challenge that we fall into is that since we think that we're not going up onto the stage, that we're like, okay, well, I'll just keep waiting, But that means you haven't crafted and refined your craft. Stephen Curry right now, as a basketball player, didn't go to the bubble, but there are videos of him constantly in the gym. He's in the gym, not because the game is going to be next week, but because he wants to be ready when the game comes. So if you get into a rhythm of creating, let's say just one sermon a month, right? Your rhythm is a month. Well, now the gift is when you get into that pressure, or if God does shift you, you're so used to working through in a certain way.
My graduation, I have to do a 100-page paper.
Yeah.
Oops. My fault, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, so you're so used to walking it through that then you'll walk through in the same preparation and it will be there. It is, we call it muscle memory, but really what it is your ability to flow so that you can unconsciously think about things. When you drive home, some of y'all, you done looked up like 17 lights later, 3 miles down the expressway, you're like this, how did I get here, right? Because you've done it so much that it becomes second nature. And when you do that for preaching, well, what that does is it means that you don't have to focus on the things that should be regular, because that happens. Now you can put the focus on the things that are difficult for you. How do I unmind this text maybe a little more? What more creative things can I add? Because I already have the basics. Well, I know I got to run because I got to finish doing this recording. Anything else you need from me, Reverend Vet?
No, thank you so much. If you guys will stay on for just a second. Love you so much. God bless you.
Thank you, Pastor Jason.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back.
What a blessing. What a blessing. Thank you.
Love y'all
so much. Learned so much.
All right.